Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is, I think, the penultimate session of our Romantic Manifesto by Ayn Rand. This is my favorite chapter. That's goal of my writing. And today it's going to be, we're going to start with Joia, then Maritza, and then Rob and Sherri. And then we're going to have a lightning round of questions for the panelists on art. Okay, so Joia, take it away.
This is absolutely my favorite chapter too, and it's really hard for me to go first. I was telling Shrikant before we started, for most of these sessions, you might have noticed I would have picked a passage or two that I wanted to talk about. In preparing for this week, if you can see my book, like there are marks like all across every single page. So I want to start with the idea. She has this sentence that art is the technology of the soul. And one of the reasons this is my favorite chapter is because it starts to bring together many of the different strands we've been talking about, even in our discussions and obviously throughout the whole book. And I want to even pick up with one of the ideas we've been talking about, which is the idea of art as fuel. And we were also talking about another potential idea of talking about art as nutrition, and really getting into what is the purpose of art. And here we really hear from Ayn Rand, her view on what that is. And that's where I wanted to start. So this was a passage I'd like to share. She says, although the representation of things as they might be and ought to be, which is what Ayn Rand thinks Romanticism is, and part of the goal of her writing, just to add that. She says, this helps man to achieve these things in real life. This is only a secondary value. The primary value is that it gives him the experience of living in a world where things are as they ought to be. This experience is of crucial importance to him. It is his psychological lifeline. Since man's ambition is unlimited, since his pursuit and achievement of values is a lifelong process, and the higher the values, the harder the struggle, man needs a moment, an hour of some period of time in which he can experience the sense of his completed task, the sense of living in a universe where his values have been successfully achieved. It is like a moment of rest, a moment to gain fuel to move farther. Art gives him that fuel. Art gives him the experience of seeing the full, immediate, concrete reality of his distant goals. The importance of that experience is not in what he learns from it, but in that he experiences it. The fuel is not a theoretical principle, not a didactic message, but the life-giving fact of experiencing a moment of metaphysical joy, a moment of love for existence. A given individual may choose to move forward to translate the meaning of that experience into the actual course of his own life, or he may fail to live up to it and spend the rest of his life betraying it. But whatever the case may be, the artwork remains intact, an entity complete in itself, an achieved, realized, immovable fact of reality, like a beacon raised over the dark crossroads of the world, saying, this is possible. So I would love for us to start our discussion here, now that she's fleshed out a bit even her concept of what the fuel of art is all about, that it gives us this experience, and it's an experience we need psychologically, the way she describes it as a psychological lifeline, that art is for you, particularly if you are ambitious. As she says here, your potential as a human being is unlimited, but the more ambitious you are, the harder you are going to struggle, and therefore the more, she suggests, you will need art, precisely so you can have this experience of seeing this is possible and experiencing what it would be like to live in that reality. I love her phrase here, this moment of metaphysical joy, a love for existence. So I would love to hear from my other panelists and everyone else in the group how this relates to your own experiences of art and what art does for you.
Thanks, Sherri. Next up is Maritza.
I just love that that's the quote you chose. It's written down. It's one of the quotes I did write down when I was trying to narrow down which of all the choice ones in this chapter would be the best to present to everyone here. And you know, Ayn Rand starts the chapter by reminding us again that art does not teach. From her perspective, she does tell us that, it just shows, it displays the full concretized reality of the final goal. And then she goes forth from there and she explains herself through the lens of art, literature and writing. And the phrase that I had wanted to share with you is, she makes several strong statements, but the one that speaks to me most is, she says, that which is not worth contemplating in life is not worth recreating in art. And I find that to be so deep a statement, because it ties in with this notion that we've been exploring here together, and some of us in other aspects, just the whole concept of make your life meaningful in all things. And why on earth would you waste time with art that is not, doing exactly that? It's not helping to make life meaningful. And if we want to look at art and see what is possible, as Joia just told us, right? And that's what we want. We want to be uplifted. Then we should ensure that what we're seeking out is things that do bring to us a worth, a meaning to our life. Rand also says, she says, in art and in literature, the end and the means, or the subject and style, must be worthy of each other. And, we're going to go into this more in future, but basically it's that being worthy of the things that we produce, that the concept of that, to me, it's so simple, but so often overlooked in today's society. And Ayn Rand states that she writes for the basic childish pleasure that she's writing what she likes and what she wants to see. And you ask yourself, seriously, all these essays and novels, and it's that simple? And it is. It's that concept of, if it is meaningful to you, move toward it. And there's such beauty and simplicity in that statement. And I don't know that there's so many quotes and things you can pull out of this chapter, and so much else, but the very simple, give it meaning statement. I'm going to stop there, because I think that is just what I really wanted to point out, because that's what I see as what she's telling us about the goal of her writing. And it's also the entire reason that she put together these essays into this book. Her culmination is a plea to us to live our lives with meaning, to make everything we produce something that is worthy of ourselves and of our future. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Rob and Sherri.
That was beautiful.
All right, so we're going to sort of tag team on this, but I'll start off and then kick the ball to Sherri. And
We don't actually tag, do we?
we're tag teaming or we're kicking the ball, one or the other. We're mixing sports metaphors today. All right,
Wow.
So one of the things I want to mention is this is the last, the Romantic Manifesto is the last of Ayn Rand's nonfiction books that I read. And now,
which I think is hilarious.
Yeah, she thinks it's funny because it was, what was
third.
It was the third one you read. The second one I read was Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. So you see we're coming at this from different angles here. But this is the last I read, and I actually put off reading it because having heard some of the things that she said about art, or having heard about some of the things she said about art, I heard this idea of art is supposed to represent your implicit philosophy and have your implicit metaphysics. And I thought she meant didacticism in art, that art is supposed to be didactic, that it's supposed to be a way of explaining and showing your explicit philosophy. And I thought, well, I think I'm going to disagree with that. So I put off, I had so much enjoyment agreeing with most of what Ayn Rand said and everything I'd read for us up to that point. I was like, I think I'm going to disagree with this. So I'm putting this off. Finally, I buckled down and got into it. And of course, that's not what she's saying. And this is the chapter, what I find interesting about this chapter is this is the chapter where she really gets into taking that on specifically about the didacticism versus what she's doing and contrasting the two and explaining to you what the difference is. And, you know, when you think about it, there is my misunderstanding was not entirely, you know, without basis, because when you hear somebody saying that art is a concretization of metaphysics, or that it reflects the artist's implicit philosophy and conveys an implicit philosophy, there is, you know, a tendency to think, okay, well, maybe that means that art is really just about conveying philosophical ideas. So we need something that describes to us what exactly is the difference between that. Now, I think the two passages or two phrases in the chapter that really sum that up for me in just a simple visual way. One, she says, where the purpose of an airplane is not to teach people how to fly, it's to give them the experience of flying. Mm-hmm. And then the other is when she says that art doesn't tell, it shows. Mm-hmm. So the question is asked, well, what does it mean to tell versus to show in art? And how do we tell when they're doing that? And the reason I think that is a certain urgency today, and this is what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this, is I've been noticing a trend, and I've been writing about this, Sherri and I both have been writing about this for a couple of years now, that there is a trend toward political didacticism in art right now. A trend toward the idea that art has to be politically correct, that it has to have the right political message, and that if it has the right political message, that's more important than anything else about the art, mm-hmm. including whether it's any particularly good. So the question I want to look at is, what does it mean? What's the difference between art sort of being a concretization of metaphysics in the way that Ayn Rand means it versus art being didactic? What's the difference between telling and showing? I think the basic idea that is that if your art is showing the reader, if it is doing metaphysics in the way that Ayn Rand is talking about, then the message of the art comes bottom up from the details of the art. That the message and the meaning of it is produced from the details of the art itself, versus something coming top down from the a speech, from the speeches or from something that somebody says about the art and tells you about its meaning. So we are going to. I'm going to kick it over here to Sherri, and she's going to look at examples. So this is based on an article. We're
going to share screen.
We're going to put the URL out there of the article we wrote on this a couple years back. This is from 2017.
Actually, I wrote that one.
I think it's co-authored.
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
It's not. Stealing my work again.
All right. So it's an article she wrote about an example of this sort of didacticism in art. So
I give you credit because you pushed me to write it. Okay. How about that?
All right.
All right.
Should we just share screen on this?
Yes.
And go
to... Yeah, while he's sharing screen, to give you an example of what Rob was just explaining, of details from the artwork building up to a meaning. We did that was last week, the week before, when we looked at the Michelangelo sculpture. So this is, and for those of you in New York probably know about this. I think we wrote this piece, or I wrote this piece 5 years ago. You pushed me.
4 or 5 years ago.
Okay, so about 4 or 5 years ago, this was a piece of art that was put in place. You can see in the picture on the right, was put in place in front of the the Charging Bull on Wall Street. And she was placed there without permission, just so everybody knows. There's a reason for that, because that's what happened with the bull. The bull was put there in the middle of the night without approval, without any permission. And it was so well received that they got all the official permissions, and it has stood there since. So this piece had done the same thing. They plopped it in the middle of the night. Nobody knew who put it there, why it was there, or anything. It just appeared one day and made a huge stir. It's called Fearless Girl. And this is an example of how artists, it comes from the top down, how it's teaching instead of showing. And we're going to go through the details so you can see that. The title Fearless Girl was given to it when it was placed here. This was a piece of art that had been made before, and I'll get to that later. But we'll take the title Fearless Girl in our mind as we look at the details of it. And the first thing I want to point out is her stance. So when you're looking at a full figure, I mean, we're all humans, we can copy emotion that is in a work of art, a work of sculpture, and we can see if this is even possible. In this particular case, if any of you want to try standing, Rob and I were doing this before we got on, to try to stand in this pose. Now, granted, she's what, 8? She's got a lot more flexibility than the rest of us have. But still, that is an extremely difficult pose to stand, because if she were up on her toes, it would be it would be like she's moving forward. But her feet, her heels are completely down. Her knees are locked. Her hips are jutted forward, and her spine is twisted back in a way that's not conducive to moving forward. It's kind of landlocked, pegged in there in a tight position. And I really want to talk about this stance as an example. So I've got a couple more pieces to show you, to talk about the way that the figure is positioned. And you probably can all kind of think of, you've all seen an ancient Egyptian statue where it's completely straightforward. Usually the legs are in line, solidly locked feet. There's no motion in the human body. If any of you have taken Pilates classes, you've spent a lot of time focusing on whether your hip bones were neutral or tilted forward or tilted backward. All of that comes into play in the details of a work of art. So let's go forward, Rob. You're going to drive this one. Okay.
Sorry, no, I didn't. Here we go.
Oh, so now we're bigger. Okay, that's helpful. Forward. Here we go. So this is a work of sculpture by St. Gaudens called Piping Pan.
Piping Pan.
And if for any of you who haven't seen this work, it is down in Brook Green Gardens in South Carolina, which is a sculpture lover's paradise if you haven't ever been there. Yeah, it's a long way to get there. But so notice here, there's a slightly similar pose, but notice the way that the hips are in this one versus Fearless Girl. The hips are tilted, the pelvis is tilted forward, not in that massively exaggerated, really hard to hold pose, but the slight tilt forward that causes a slight tilt backward, but it's not so rigid. And for any of you who have seen little kids of this age, this is a really common pose. There's something impish about this age group that they tend to do this kind of a tilt forward of the pelvis pose. It's kind of a little sassy, like I know it all kind of thing in a good way, if you know what I mean. And it's been said that St. Gaudens actually went and found a young street urchin, a young little boy, to pose so that he could get this very specific, exact pose right. And you notice that the every part of the way the body moves is a natural way. This is a work where he was specifically trying to capture that impish quality, which of course makes perfect sense if you're creating Pan, who's quite a little mischievous imp. But Oh, we've got somebody coming in. Shrikant can take care of that. But I think another way to show this kind of body gesture is in another pose, another sculpture I wanted to show you, where you can see it more face on, so you can see the shaping that happens. Okay, 1 second. We're gonna.
Why can't I do this?
Give us a second.
There we go.
Okay, so this is a bust, a sculpture called Vitality, not a bust, torso. And I like to show this one because, by Sandra Shaw. I like to show this one because I find it fascinating that some people think you can't tell the meaning of a work of art without a head or without a face or without a full body. Well, we don't have arms, legs, or even a head, but you can tell here. And this is an excellent example of the kind of motion you would get in a real pose, in a body that, in this particular case, full of vitality. So notice here at the hips, we have not rigid straight across. We've got one hip is up and one hip is down. And if you put your hands on your hip and you try to walk, that's the natural rocking back and forth that our human bodies do. And so to have a pose where we're completely rigid, it is not telling you that this is a figure that is moving through the world with their own power. It's rigidly planted in place. But notice when the hips are tilted at this natural angle, one leg tends to go forward. Now, we'll talk about Pilates here, but we can also talk about dance. So if you're a ballroom dancer, or you're doing salsa, or you're doing the rumba, this is a huge part of your dance. Your motion comes from the core. You move one hip up and the leg follows. So you're seeing that happening in this piece, but there are other things that follow through that. So once the hip comes up, the shoulders move. And notice that here, one hip goes up, one shoulder goes up. There's a twist around, forward and back of the shoulders, and you can see that with these. One arm goes forward, one arm goes back. This is a body in motion. This is a body full of vitality, out in the world doing things. And let's go back to the fearless girl for a second. So here, Rob, I wrote an article about this, and Rob's going to put the link in.
It links up.
Oh, he's already put the link in. And we'll get into more of that in a second. Rob will probably get into part of this. But what really bothered me when I saw this piece was what they're trying to say was very much this idea of girl power, having the strength to go out into the world and take on whatever comes your way. And oddly, in this particular case, they're talking about a raging bull. But here she is planted so rigidly and so unmoving that it just never felt to me like there's nothing fearless. There's nothing that she's gone out and accomplished in the world. There's nothing that she physically is immovable. And that's when Rob and I started doing some research into what was happening with this piece. Who put this out here? Do you want to take this part?
Well, yeah. So the research we did found that it was an existing piece by a sculptor who sort of does garden sculpture. It's garden sculpture of children. So it's children, it's children at play. And this is the kind of sculpture she does. And this is an existing piece that she had done that these guys basically just bought and planted here.
And renamed
and
without the artist's choice.
Well, I don't know if the art, I'm sure how much the artist knew, but they put it there and renamed it and gave it a whole new meaning. This had originally just basically been a girl standing with the wind blowing past her. And then they took it and put it there. And they put it there because what they were doing is they had some sort of fund that was like in a special fund they were trying to sell that was investing in, I think, female-owned companies or something like that, female-run companies. So this was basically a publicity stunt for some guys selling you on investing in their fund. So it was very much the case that they had the message was they have this sort of like positive social message that they're sending, but it's something that's coming from the top down, from the PR they're putting around this. And as Sherri saying, not rather than coming from emerging upward from the details of the piece. And so that's sort of the issue I'm getting at with didacticism, is that this is something where a lot of people found a lot of meaning in this sculpture, but a lot of the meaning they were bringing to it is something that they were bringing to it because they liked the message it had, rather than something that was coming to them spontaneously from up above. By the way, in this, I also want to have you just take a second to look at Arthur Demodica's charging bowl here.
Yes.
Because this is, I think there's more sense of vitality and movement in this original sculpture. And it's not a style I like 100%, but he did have a real eye for the anatomy and the movement of the figure of the bowl. There's much more sort of firsthand observation and the message of the charging bowl coming from. He basically did it as a tribute to the vitality of America, the vitality of the American economy. I think he put this up after the stock market crash in '87. I gather this is an artist who had basically made a lot of money selling sculptures to guys on Wall Street, and it was like his personal debt of gratitude. I don't know that, actually. His debt of gratitude. He's an Italian sculptor who come to America. This is his debt of gratitude to America, that he felt he had to do this thing as a gift to America in tribute to the vitality of to convey the vitality of the economy.
Yeah, the other thing that we both found really disturbing about this is the imposition of taking someone else's work of art and putting it in front of another work of art, and then by that juxtaposition, changing the meaning of someone else's work of art. Now, we've been talking through this whole thing about there's what the artist brings to the table, what they are showing you. There's always what you, the viewer, are taking from it yourself. So there's always that independence that comes from the viewer. But this is a different kind of thing. This is essentially trying to change somebody else's work of art without any permission, almost a copyright kind of issue, really.
But there was a copyright. There was a
I actually think that's how they took care of it.
How do we get my thing back so I can stop the sharing?
Okay, so you hit this little red button that says stop share.
Yeah, but I can't.
I think Rob's fingers are so dry that he can't stop share.
There.
Did we lose it?
How did I escape?
Did we lose them altogether?
No, everything is good.
We stopped sharing though. We successfully stopped share.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay. So I've been tracking this sort of trend towards political didacticism in art. I've got another link I'll send to you in a minute. One that was based on, there's a poet called Rupi Kaur, I think is her name, who's become very famous by posting these poems up on Instagram. And the thing is that they are, and I'll post this link so you can go to check some of them out, is they're very sort of bland, trite sentiments. I call them, they're sort of referred to as motivational posters for hipsters, right? You remember those motivational posters that were popular in the 80s and 90s, where you'd have, teamwork, and you'd have some little bland phrase about teamwork put up. And they're very much like that. And somebody pointed out, and this is what got me started on it, is somebody pointed out that there's no actual poetic devices in these poems. They're just, these sort of phrases that sound like vaguely positive messages of affirmation, but there's no simile, there's no metaphor, there's no meter, there's no rhyme, there's nothing that actually marks them as poetry. And yet she was like a best-selling poet for doing this. And it was a case where the meaning of it wasn't coming from from it as poetry. It wasn't coming from any poetic device. It was coming from, well, this is a vaguely positive, sort of semi-feminist, I think was her angle. These vaguely positive and progressive messages of affirmation. So where the content, the message that you're getting from it is more important than the actual artistic content. But just to show that this isn't all on one side, Sherri and I wrote a piece, and we'll send this link out as well.
Yeah, and this one we really did both right.
Showing how this is, how the right has taken, as part of the culture war, the right has decided that we're going to take this up too, and we're going to have our own version of using art for didactic purposes. And this was something we wrote about almost exactly a year ago, where the Trump administration proposed, they never actually put it through, but they proposed an executive order mandating that all new federal architecture had to be done in a neoclassical style. So, you know, columns and all that. Well, by neoclassical, they actually meant something very vague, basically anything old looking and maybe with columns. And so Sherri and I, drawing on her expertise as architecture, so basically when you read that piece, the stuff about politics is mine, the stuff about architecture is hers. But looked at how, for example, one of the big examples they used as they said, well, the neoclassical architecture is appropriate to a democratic republic. Well, one of the big examples they had was the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, which is right near the White House in DC.
And you'll see all the pictures in the article.
In the article. But if you look it up, you find out that this was done in what was called the French Second Empire style, which was done under Napoleon III, but was harkening back to the style of buildings under Louis XVI. And so it was royalist and imperial architecture from France. And it's only vaguely neoclassical. It's not what you would actually call neoclassical in the history of architecture. Or they referred to the US Capitol, which has been sort of repeatedly rebuilt and become more grandiose and over the top every time it got rebuilt. And
eventually became the style known as wedding cake style.
Yeah, the Capitol Dome is what they call it. They literally called this the wedding cake style because it's all white marble, tier after tier, layer after layer, so it looks like a giant wedding cake. So it got more and more grandiose and overdone and more imperial and royalist in style, including paintings that are done on the inner dome of the U.S. Capitol Rotunda that were done by an Italian artist who had previously done all these artworks for palaces in Europe. And he does this painting of the Apotheosis of Washington, which is George Washington draped in imperial purple, being brought up to the heavens and made into a god. And this is this is over the top royalist style aggrandization of the great leader being done for a republic. So talking about how they had this thing where it's like we want to mandate neoclassical architecture in order to send a political message in the culture wars without actually understanding the underlying architecture and the message being sent by coming from the bottom up from the details of that architecture. And that message is actually the opposite of what they think that they're trying to send with this. So it's this idea of using art to send a message from the top, a political message or a didactic message from the top down, rather than having something that comes from the bottom up, emerging from the details of the work and actually giving you the experience of feeling something.
And I have the slightly tossed together. I haven't really thought about this that carefully yet, but I'm wondering if maybe part of this is happening because as a culture, we've sort of lost our knowledge of how to look at and understand art. So maybe we're, as a culture, responding to these things at some level because we don't have that skill any longer. My worry, however, is that we're not going to learn it if art is only seen in a didactic way.
Right.
So you sent the link to that one?
Yeah, I sent the link to both those articles,
Okay.
mine on didacticism and art and yours. The Architecture of Owning the Libs is from the Dispatch. That's the piece that Sherri and I did together.
And the biggest thing the audience that we're talking to here, we have spent weeks and weeks and weeks digging deep into what does art mean? How does it mean what it means? So I'm not at all worried about any of this group having this issue. But the thing is, when you look at art as a didactic or political message, it cannot have the same depth of meaning and the same depth of power as the work of art that takes those concrete details and builds up a concretized image of what's possible.
Yeah, and actually I'm going to say Sherri just kind of stole what I was going to conclude on, which is I absolutely agree with her that I think it comes partly from the fact that people haven't been educated in art. They haven't basically learned how to understand art on a deep level. And so because of that, they're looking for something to substitute for that. And I'm not the first person to observe that in our current environment, for a lot of people, politics seems to substitute for religion, as a source of meaning and a purpose in their lives, as something that gives them the sense of accomplishing something important. Is that instead of going to church on Sunday, you go onto Facebook and you argue with people about politics, or you go onto Twitter and argue with people about politics. And I think that what's also happening is politics is substituting for art, that with the lack of education, the knowledge people have on art, the fact that they're not getting the fundamental spiritual needs that they need out of art, they are substituting politics for art and substituting politics as a source of meaning in art. And politics is substituted as a source for the experience that you want out of art, the kind of life-affirming experience you want out of art. So that goes way back to something I've been saying, sort of ending on something I've been saying about the culture wars that have especially in the last 5 years or so have taken up so much bandwidth in political discussion, the so-called culture wars. And my plan for the culture wars is that culture wins, right? Culture should win the culture wars. And the way that's going to happen is if people, instead of trying to impose their politics onto the art, there's always been a culture war. And in the past, what the culture war has manifested as is, well, the humanists off in Florence create the Duomo, the giant dome of Brunelleschi's dome, and they create Michelangelo, and Michelangelo creates the David. And the culture war is everybody goes out and creates great art to express their view of the world. And if that's what the culture war is, then culture will win, right? It's everybody trying to create the best, most inspiring product or concretization of the worldview that they want to express. Or Victor Hugo, instead of giving us lectures about socialism, he writes Les Miserables to express his worldview. So the culture wins if we do it by people actually creating things that give you an experience that inspires, rather than imposing messages on things from the top down.
Wonderful. Thank you. So now for something different, what we're going to do is that I'm going to we're kind of coming to the end of this process. So I want to kind of mix things up. So I want to throw many things on the and see what I'm going to raise lots of questions, and all the panelists are also invited to raise any questions. And let's try to keep the answers short so that we can go through as many different issues. It may be revisiting same issues. So first question, what is metaphysical joy that she talks about? Anybody?
She says love of existence. And I think it's just that appreciation. It's that perspective of really getting at what is the nature of human beings and what could human beings be and what is possible in the world, in existence for human beings, and having an artwork that shows the joyous possibility of what is possible.
I think Ayn Rand puts in this particular chapter, to the glory of man. I would go so far as to say about that, and also the amazing world we live in, landscape paintings, that sort of thing. What were you going to say?
I would say that I think everybody probably has some sense introspectively of what metaphysical joy means. Like any moment in which you thought, yes, this is amazing. This is just an amazing moment to be in, to live through. Anything you've ever had that experience of, this is in itself, just being in this moment, just living this moment is is the sum total of everything I want. Now,
this makes life worth living.
Was it?
I would say this makes life worth living.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. The next question I had, comment and question. Art is basically kind of the highest ideas made fully concretized. So it's like there is something amazing at the abstract level and something amazing at the perceptual level together.
Mhm.
A lot of the things, like for example, the kinds of things that you guys are talking about, are people whose ideas are not particularly good. Like they don't really have like very deep political ideas either. So they are kind of like, those are almost slogans that they are passing off without understanding the full abstract potential. And they don't have the concrete either. So it's like missing both those things.
Mhm.
True art is enormously hard because you have to be thinking at a very deep level, and you need actually mastery of a medium, a superlative mastery of the medium to make that happen. And both those are needed. What do you think of this kind of the abstract and perception? Both. Like if I look at all great artists, they have both. Like they are, it may be implicit, but they are breaking new ground on the abstraction that they're trying to communicate, and they are doing it in. So any thoughts?
So, Shrikant, I would point out Victor Hugo to you as a contradiction to what you're saying. You know, Victor Hugo is, I mean, amazing, one of the most amazing novelists out there. But you know, Ayn Rand said it beautifully when she says that she believes that the sense of life for him never reached outside his subconscious. She believes his inability to create a heroic character in the end, despite how hard he tried to, that was that for us, she says, and here I show you exhibit A for how a dichotomy can exist within the artist and still provide for you that shining, you know, sense of life, even though in his life it's not quite matching.
No, that's a very good example. Let me elaborate on that. I mean, I would disagree with that. But so let me. The thing is that there is a grandeur in human beings that he actually has managed to capture. He understands it to a level, and that abstraction actually comes through.
Yes, I would agree.
Wow. Okay. So, and that is actually very profound. You know, what is possible to a human being? Anybody who says anything about that, which is new, is breaking new ground. Now, the place where where he fails is that he does not at the same time come up with a social system, or how would this such a being operate in the world, that he doesn't have. But that's not to say, so my argument still holds. The reason, because no, the reason why Victor Hugo is powerful is because he has created an abstraction of what grandeur is possible to a human being, and has done it. So it's I would Joia, Rob, and Sherri, what do you think about this?
I'll jump in and put up a defense for Victor Hugo. I want to agree with Shrikant too. I think your observation that the way I see it is when you don't have the concretes, it almost makes it impossible to get the abstraction, that it just becomes a slogan because you don't, even if we looked at, for example, The Fearless Girl or the other works that Sherri were showing us, it's like when you're not really looking at reality and seeing something, you don't have the base to start from. I always like to think of this as a spiral, and I think the spiral does start by looking at the world first and looking at the details and looking at the concretes, and then you kind of go up and start to make abstractions, and maybe you do make it at this emotional level first, and that's where Hugo is, and then ideally you're going back to the concretes, and it's a spiral and it's building. I would agree too that perhaps we wish that Hugo got to maybe a higher ring of the spiral where he went back and looked at the concretes he talks about in Les Mis and said, okay, how do I take what I'm projecting here with these characters, and how would I put this together into a theoretical presentation of a social system? And he didn't get to that level of the spiral, but he certainly made a lot of progress on that spiral. And I think it starts with that real love of the concretes and then the ambition to try to express something.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the reason why it's so rare to find that is because often the mind that is fascinated with the detail that's necessary to be that fascinated with, to make really great art. You have to see all of that and form those abstractions. The same mind that does that level of love of detail often doesn't circle around to the highest level of abstraction. That's what makes those rare artists that can do that extraordinary. It's just, and the thing is, I think it's okay that the world only has a few of those shining stars that happen in our lifetimes. The great thing is, over the course of human history, we can share in all that previous shining stars that were there. But it's difficult because it's two radically different modes of thinking almost that have to coalesce so seamlessly that the work just flows almost naturally out of the person, and there isn't this sense of tortured work that, you know, it doesn't feel like it's a natural flowing of detail from the whole piece.
One last thing, because you got us going on something we're obviously very excited about. But one thing that I remember observing is that oftentimes is looking at the effect of ideas in history, because there's sort of tends to be an objectivist idea that, well, the philosophers come along and they come up with these great ideas, and the ideas trickle down from the philosophers to everybody else. And I was looking at ancient Greek, the development of ancient Greece. There was something we saw, I think it was at the British Museum. There's this wonderful display, sort of chronological display of vase paintings. And you see something going on in the vase paintings, this radical change going on in the vase paintings, this radical improvement in their ability to observe the world accurately and represent it accurately, that happens before the philosophers are doing anything at all, right? So I think sometimes you have something where the artists are doing it, and, you know, sort of, I want to sort of speak up in defense of the artist, that for an idea to come into the world and have an impact, it doesn't need to come into the world in the form of a philosopher writing something down first. It could come into the world in the form of an artist creating it, you know, in a work of art. And then the philosophers are kind of trailing behind sometimes, saying, wait a minute, there's something going on here. Let's try to figure out what this is. And, you know, they're part of the, you know, they're influenced by the same development and coming up with their ideas. But oftentimes ideas will be seen first in art and then later in more explicit ideas.
And it makes sense because, you know, an idea forms in our own heads implicitly first before it becomes explicit. It has to.
Yeah,
absolutely. So that was my next question. So my question was, are artists harbingers of ideas? And that's what Rob is saying. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at people like, look at people like Michelangelo, you know, like what is shown in what is possible to human beings. In that sense, even Victor Hugo, right? Or what he's showing is possible to human beings is a level higher. And then, you know, people. Okay, next question. Technology of soul. So if art is technology of a soul, how should people be using art? What?
They should use it to fly. There's my quick answer.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I mean,
so I actually want to say something about that because I think it will.
But Joia just did.
She said, yeah, I know.
It was perfect.
It's perfect, but I want to mention something related to that. It's not quite the same thing related to that, which is one question I've sort of had that I've looked at a little bit is the question of how do you change your sense of life? Right. And because that's one of the things people are looking at, you know, I read a series of articles a while back about basically how to achieve a benevolent sense of life. Right. And so what happens if you find that, you know, my sense of life, what if you identify a problem with your sense of life that you have, you identify you have a malevolent sense of life, that there's these, you know, premises, there's some assumptions lurking there about doom and gloom and all of that. and you want to change your sense of life. And the most disastrous thing I've seen people try to do is to change it from the top down, right? To sort of talk themselves into having a different sense of life. And the way to do it is you have to do it from the bottom up, and you have to find, and you primarily do it by one of the major ways you do it is by finding works of art that you regard that not that you make yourself enjoy, but you actually find something enjoyable in them. You find you get in touch with what it is, how it is they're doing things on that concrete bottom up level, and that is one of the things that can help you to discover something new, to bring something, import something new into your soul that you need from that work of art. But it has to be from, looking through them and trying to understand them and trying to get them from the bottom up, and not just sort of telling yourself, oh, I should like this kind of art because that would be better, right?
Right.
Because
Can
that
I,
always leaves empty.
So Shrikant, I want to bring up a very short, quick poem to answer your last two questions. The poets light, but lamps themselves go out. The wicks, they stimulate a vital light. In here, as do the suns, each age a lens, disseminating their circumference. That's by Emily Dickinson. And she is a longtime favorite of mine. And this poem, every time I read it, I hear that. I hear her stating that, artists are just, they're just a guiding light, a guiding beacon. We still have to put in the work for ourselves, for our souls, but, they give us something to step upon.
Wonderful. Next question. So folks, you can also ask questions. So I have a whole bunch of questions, but you can also ask whatever questions that you would like to bring up. Next question is about the aesthetic sense. I mean, you might have noticed, when Sherri is talking about works of art, the level of observations that she has is not just about the technical details, about the art, but about what is being portrayed. So I think having aesthetic sense is a very powerful way of being able to move from concretes to abstractions and abstractions to concretes. And doing that and being able to see, actually, it's, Leonardo talked about learning to see. Okay, there is a lot that is involved in that. So art actually develops your ability to be able to move, to kind of go back and forth between abstracts and concrete. So any thoughts on that?
It most definitely does. We like to use art education as a way to, teaching technique as a way to teach kids how to see. When you send them out into the world to draw birds, the fact that they're drawing one bird and they have to observe the details, and that teaches them to see, oh, well, that bird has a different shaped beak. That level of seeing comes from the skill of drawing or painting or sculpting or writing about whatever it is. What? Oh, yeah, actually, Rob's saying you should talk about Oscar and his painting of trees. And Maritza knows this because I was telling her this. Our youngest has been painting trees, and when we were talking to him in the car one day, I asked him why he chose to paint that tree. What inspired him to draw to paint that tree? And he said, I've always known that trees are big at the bottom and little tiny branches at the top, but until I painted it, I didn't know how it really worked from one to the next to the next. So that's a real example. That's a real example, being able to learn to see. because it's very common for us to, we have to be able to walk through life and do our regular activities. We have to use abstractions to just get through the day. We can't go through life at the rate of a toddler walking through Central Park, or we would never make a paycheck. But learning that skill to observe at fine details spills over into all other parts of your life.
Wonderful. Does anybody else have questions for the other panelists?
Can I just tie something onto what Sherri said and try to maybe incorporate literature then into this conversation too? Because I love this description of what happens in the visual arts, that you really have to learn how to see. And I think there's a parallel too when you're creating literature, which is that you have to learn how to see human beings. And you have to have, I think, a deep sense of what goes on inside a human being, especially in literature, where you really get that access to what is going on in the internal world, even more so than in a movie or any other kind of narrative. Literature, we've talked about this in a previous discussion, especially since the 19th century with all the great novels. A huge part of what that technology is all about is really understanding what goes on internally. So then there's a parallel skill, I think, of being able to look at human beings to understand what is it that really is going on. And then what Ayn Rand here is saying is then to project out what would the ideal person be doing, what kinds of activities would they be engaging in, what kinds of values would they be pursuing, what kind of conflicts would that bring up if they were in pursuit of that value, and then what would be happening inside their minds. I think that really is the skill that the literary artist and the novelist is developing and displaying when they get it right.
Wow, excellent.
I have
go
one
ahead.
more. If I could throw one more thing, I'm going to connect what Joia just said to as a nonfiction writer.
What you're going to talk about next week.
Well, one of the things, so I'm sort of stealing a little bit of what I'm going to talk about next week, but one of the things that I always recommend to when I was teaching writing classes, one of the things I recommend to students is find one of the best ways you can learn how to write is by finding people whose writing you love and reading a lot of writing that you love and seeing what they're showing you is how to think. How to put ideas together, how to create a chain of argument from one idea to the next. And a really great writer will sort of give you the experience of doing that in a way that an artist, gives you a way that a novelist will give you the experience of a character introspecting and seeing what's going on inside his soul. A really good writer will give you the experience of taking you on a chain of thoughts that connect together and teaching you how to think. And that's a hugely valuable thing for, if you're looking to be a writer, to be able to express your own thoughts, is find somebody who's really good at putting those together and using that as, again, a model building, right? Is you go by going through the experience of going through it as somebody else has done it, you learn how to model your own actions on that and how to learn to do it yourself.
Wonderful. Okay, so I have one more question, and then if anybody else has questions. One of my pet issues on art is that I'm against spectator art, and I'm all for participatory art. And that's, I think, a huge thing, because you can't really enjoy art or see the full scope of it until you start doing something. And doesn't mean that you have to do all art, but at least something you have to do, because the moment you start doing it, however badly, you're actually going to get a tremendous amount of feedback about what it is. So it is the pursuit of connecting up the highest abstractions with the concretes. And you need to do that yourself in order to actually get anything from art, I think. I mean, I'll put it, the most extreme way possible. What do you guys think?
I agree 110%. And I'll just add the other lesson that I learned on top of that is that prolific is better than perfect. And there was a great example I heard of this where these researchers, they had people creating ceramic pots. And one group, they gave them the assignment that there were certain standards they had to meet, but the goal was to just kind of generate as many of these ceramic pots as possible. And the other group, they were trying to, just create the one perfect ceramic pot. And after running this experiment, they found that the people who actually tried to be prolific and and focus on quantity actually got more feedback and got better than the people who were just focused on trying to create the one perfect work. So definitely, if you haven't tried doing any artwork of your own, try to do artwork and don't worry about being perfect. Prolific is better than perfect because that's how you get the feedback and that's how you grow.
I want to throw in something about about creating art, because I mentioned before that performing music is something that I do, and one of the appeals of it for me is that it's the opposite of what I'm doing most of the time in my work, which is you're focused on the abstract. Whereas performing music, you have to focus on the concrete. You have to focus on every single note. If you lose focus, you get lost, or you're not in, you miss things, or you stumble over it because you're thinking about what you're doing. You can't think too far ahead. You can't think too much about what I'm going to be doing, 6 measures from now. You can't let other thoughts creep in. You have to be very focused on the present moment. But now I think about it, this is something I probably should have mentioned in that question about metaphysical joy, because especially as an amateur, if you're going to take up playing the piano, in my case, or especially playing the violin, because it's way more difficult. If you're going to take up doing it, you're basically committing to a lifestyle of, I'm going to be practicing this every day for the rest of my life. And if you're going to be doing that commitment of doing something every day for the rest of your life, it had better be fulfilling in and of itself. Yeah. And so basically you have to do it because you love the music and you love creating the music and you love the experience of being, as I put it, inside the piece of music in a way that you can only get when you're performing it. So if we're talking about metaphysical joy, right now, there's a lot of frustration that can go through it. Sometimes in our house, you'll hear me shouting Ludwig, because I'm in the middle of, I'm learning some Beethoven. And
every night at about 6:30.
Yes. So I painted myself in the corner. I did the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata, which is difficult, but not horribly difficult. And then I said, well, I'll do the second movement too. And the second movement is even easier than the first movement. And it's shorter and it's easier to learn. So I said, well, then I'll do the third movement, which is 10 pages of presto agitato. And presto agitato is an Italian musical term. It means Ludwig needs to cut back on the espresso. So it's incredibly difficult. So we hear me yelling, Ludwig. It can be very frustrating when you're learning it. But once you've learned a piece, and you're in that sort of maintenance mode. I've got like half a dozen pieces where I've learned it and I play through it, not necessarily every day, but fairly often. And that's when you get the metaphysical joy, the sense of being inside of a piece of music. And that way you can only do when you're performing it, where you're able to appreciate and understand every single note because you have to produce every single note. And so it's the metaphysical joy that keeps you going through the lifestyle of wanting to be an amateur performer. Yeah.
I really like, go ahead. So I just want to say one thing. I really like your term being inside.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. Go ahead, Sherri.
I just want everybody here to notice that Shrikant keeps talking about needing to be an active role in making art, whatever that is for you. And he's never shared it with any of us.
That's true. That's true. Good, very good observation. So the next question.
And notice how we get a shift to the
next. Let's see. So what I want to do is I want to bring in. So firstly, does any of the panelists have questions for anybody else?
It looks like Rupali has a question.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to now bring in everybody. So what we can do is that instead of the breakout rooms, we can just treat these as breakout rooms, but we are going to focus on, so everybody you can just put questions. Let's just put questions on the table, okay? Because that's the most valuable thing you can do. Raise a good question. Rupali, you can do comment and question if you want.
Okay, thank you. I was like, now I have to think of a question because I was actually thinking of a comment.
Go ahead.
Great discussion. Thank you, everybody. It's just a wonderful topic. So we're talking about metaphysical joy. I wanted to touch on several points, but I'll start with metaphysical joy. And as Shrikant said, creating versus observing. When you're creating, you're in the flow, in that moment. And Rob talked about this, the focus, being in the moment. Mihaly, and I don't know how to say his last name, but
Csikszentmihalyi.
Say that again.
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
All right. So he actually did a lot of research on flow, and he wrote this book. I put that in the chat, and he talks about an artist, a musician, a writer getting in the flow, and that joy that you get, that feeling of satisfaction, accomplishment. I think the sculpture that Sherri shared with us last week about, Michelangelo with his satisfied smile. I think that captures it. And the question is, so how is it done, and how is it possible? As people who've created art or have written things, what are some of the lessons you've learned that you would like to share about how to achieve that state?
I would like to say, just keep trying. If you don't get it the first time, keep going. I also would like to point out that, it is a different feeling of accomplishment when you do something that is art related, as opposed to something. So for, example, I'm always getting myself into random things that I know nothing about. It's like, I want to try this. So, I decided to bust up the floor in my bathroom and make a new floor because I'm an idiot. Next time I'm calling someone. But when I had the floor redone, it was so satisfying. I did that. Yes, I did all that hard work. And it was extremely satisfying, but it doesn't even come close to holding a candle to the satisfaction I get saying to people, I have written a VNL. Yes, with the absolutely perfect, correct pentameters, syllables, it's perfect. That like I can't even say it without smiling. And it is a different, they're both feelings of accomplishment, but that's the difference there, is that one of them is feeding my soul, the other one is just giving me calluses. But it really, there is a difference there. And failure is a part of life. And in art, failures can be so devastating. If you try to draw a horse and it looks like a monkey and you're like, what the heck did I do here? Don't stop. When I was younger, I used to write poetry. When I felt like life was super out of control, it would just be like this word vomit that would just like flow from my hands onto the paper. And when I was done, I would ball it up and throw it away. And I did it for years. And it was eating at me and I didn't realize it. And I stopped doing that. And I think that being able to have this art it helps you grow as a person. Like, we're talking about our consciousness being our soul, as it were. And if we are, trying to bring our sense of life into our day to day, basically what we're doing is we're feeding our soul.
I think you need a prepared environment. And Rupali is going to laugh at that answer. It's a Montessori concept, but as adults, we can do the same thing. One of the things that it's especially critical when you're in a pandemic and you're working from home. Maybe you've got kids and dogs and cats and phones ringing and your friend Jack texting you 500 texts at 6:30 in the morning, and it's going bing, 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 bing. It's very hard to find that state of flow. But I do a few things. Well, first of all, when we get a chance to do something that is when you're not disturbed, we fight over who gets to mow the lawn, because when you mow the lawn, you get to sit out there, sit on the riding mower and go back and forth and nobody bothers you, and you can sink deep into your thoughts. I go to the wood shop, I go sand wood. That's another really great way for me to get into deep thoughts. But if I'm creating something physical or playing or designing, I find that it's important to prepare the environment. So you get all of the electronics that bing and bang and bong, you'll unplug them, turn them on silent, and they're not even in the room, so you can't even be tempted. You take a few minutes to, if there's a door you can shut where this is the space that you do this thing, that's a great way, because then you'll develop the habit that you go through that door, and that's a sacred space for creating those things, and the other stuff's not allowed in. Sometimes I use music. So I have found accidentally that if I practice cello before I need to get into a really big design project, I could just practice my scales, put the cello down, and my brain is right there, and I can design faster than I've ever designed before. And then when I get stuck on something, I just pick up the cello and play a few pieces, set it back down, and I'm right back in it. There's something about that flow state that comes from not having those interruptions and letting yourself get into it. You have to eliminate other things from it, though. You just have to be ruthless about blocking all that out to make that space, to make that happen.
This, by the way, is why I write about 80% of my pieces at 3 o'clock in the morning in my pajamas.
It's also why Rob and I at one point used to have, we shared an office, and we're in the process of rebuilding that space. And I have, maybe this is what I should tell you. He's not allowed in there because he talks about politics.
Yeah.
So he's going to be in another spot. That's where the creativity and the music happens. Sorry, dear.
The other thing I would say, I mean, this is what, this is again, one of my pet peeves, is that people mindlessly consume things like television and social media. And that is really draining. It just is, and it's not as if they like it. They just mindlessly consume it. So anyway, next up is Rupali, followed by Les. Rupali. So folks, it's now takeaways and question time, so you can make a comment. Now, the entire series is fair game, so you can talk about your takeaways from any part of the series and have any questions that you have. Rupali.
So, I was just thinking about what Sherri said about the prepared environment. That is so dear to me. So in Montessori, we prepare the environment for the child to be successful, to be in the ability to, be in the flow so that they can get their work done. And there's, the beginning of the flow cycle, the middle where they actually get deep work done, and then you put things away and you transition to something else. But one of the things Ayn Rand talks about is romantic, how naturalists think of romantic art as an escape. And the whole idea about the prepared environment made me think about escape. If we prepare our environment where our environment reflects our values, and if it reflects the goals that we want to achieve, and you can do that with art, the art that you surround yourself with, the books that you surround yourself with, the music that you surround yourself with, then you don't need an escape. You don't need a vacation. You don't need to go anywhere, because everything that you need is right there in your prepared environment. And it's just an observation. I just was able to put two and two together when Sherri mentioned the prepared environment. So just an observation. Thank you.
Rupali, I'll link that with something that it's like my favorite quote from the Mihai Csikszentmihalyi book that you mentioned, Flow. There's a part in that book where he says that many people think that what they want is leisure, but actually the experiences that people say are most meaningful and the best experiences of their life are when they are engaged and in flow. So it's not the mindless leisure of watching television, like Shrikant was saying. It is when they perhaps have the prepared environment or have that space where they can be in flow and be totally engaged. So I love how everything is just kind of coming together in this conversation.
And speaking of vacations, Rupali, I have started calling my cello practice or my cello lessons my cellocation. And I've had long discussions with my cello teacher about that because they are exactly that. I come back from them quite often exhausted, but totally refreshed at the same time.
Sorry, thank you. Next up is going to be Les and Marco. Les.
Yeah, just I'd like to say the yes to everyone as far as the comments around the metaphysical joy. I think that's right on. There's so many descriptions of that. And I found too, going back to what Ayn Rand was saying at the beginning of the book in the introduction, she said that really her manifesto included the parts of the previous chapter on Hugo, and also this chapter. And of course, Hugo was a very big impression, and somebody too that she will really benefit from. And but also, I was reading his biography, and one of the things that he was a prolific writer, and he had certain routines that he followed to get the most of his production he could. And when he was in Guernsey, I think one of the Channel Islands, he had a few rules that he wouldn't be interrupted when he was doing his writing. And also, like he talked about, there was wonderful sculpture and wonderful artwork that he had. He had some great paintings. So obviously those were things that gave him a lot of joy, metaphysical joy. But when it came to his writing room, his study, he went with plain curtains. He didn't have any of that stuff because I think probably he was looking at it as a distraction, the focus he needed to concentrate on his work. So I thought, this just goes to what you're saying around the preparation of the environment. And he made certainly he wasn't going to get interruptions. There's only a few times when people might interrupt him. Maybe it was some sort of tragedy that happened and somebody had to get a hold of him, but otherwise, he just locked himself into his environment, gave him the exclusion, eliminated any possible distraction to begin with, and went on with his work, from there. So I just thought I'd make that comment.
That's lovely. In my work as an architect, I do almost exclusively residential architecture, and I've had a number of clients where I'm creating a workspace for them. One pair of clients are both writers, and I created a space for each of them. I get into detailed discussions with them about how they get into that flow state. And for one writer, her space is up on the second floor, quiet on the street, hidden so that there are heavy, thick cedar trees right outside of her window. So there's no view, except for a small little one over in the spot. There's a little distant view of mountains. Because for her, she needs those distractions removed and feel like she's essentially in a nest, up with the birds, she called it. Her husband, another writer, had quite the opposite need. He said, I like to look way far off in the distance. So we put his office, his writing space, on the opposite side of the house, with views to the distant mountains. And that's how we found out where each of them had the best way of working. So you can do it in architecture too, for how to create the space. You have to do a lot of introspection to find out what works for you to get into that flow state. But you can most definitely make that your environment a productive element in getting into that state.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Marco, followed by Rupali. Marco.
Yeah, it was a great presentation, and I guess the main point that I sort of like got out of it was basically like looking at something, at a piece of art that you like will sort of like help you in your sort of like abstraction, concrete. It'll help in your own thinking. So, and I guess what I got out of that point was like, I guess it's probably important because like maybe subconsciously, like you don't know what you need, like in your own self sometimes. So like, if you like pay attention to what you do, like it's sort of like an insight to your inner self, basically. Like, so yeah, to just like being aware of what you do like, and it's, yeah.
Yes, Rob and Sherri.
You're very right, Marco. One of the things when I'm struggling to write something, I can't quite put it to words. Rob always tells me, this is the writing teacher again, always says, well, say it out loud. There's something about, and I always joke, there's something about when the words come out of your head and then back into your ears, they hit your brain in a different way. It's kind of the same way with art. Maybe if you talk about it or write about what you like about it, you'll see those details of what you're responding to in a different way, and they can help you build a love of that work or an understanding of your own response to the work.
Yeah, I thought the observation about that you can learn about yourself by your response to art is a very profound one. And I found that especially for great works of art that are complex, like Hugo's works or Atlas or Fountainhead or something like that, or even great paintings. I don't know about great paintings for sure, but for literature for sure. Every time I go back to it in, let's say, a couple of years or 5 years, my response is different because it's such a complex work of art that it is hitting so many things. And depending on where I am, what it hits is actually different. So you can tell what you've been doing by just going and looking. It's like a mirror with it's a complex mirror, and it just shows you where you've been and what's important to you now based on your reactions.
And also another tip is when you're looking at things or reading novels or observing great architecture, do it with friends who know you well, because sometimes they'll say things about your reaction to what you're seeing that make it one of those aha moments for you. For example, we were once traveling with a friend through Rome, and I was in some awful kind of grouchy mood, and and it was spilling over to the people who were around us, and the friend that was with us stopped in the road and turned to me and he said, I know what's going on. And I looked at him like, what are you talking about? He goes, you're grouchy because you're seeing all this old civilization of Rome, and it's like dead bodies in the catacomb to you. And it was an instant lightning bolt. It's like, that's exactly why I'm grouchy as can be. And just saying that, or having, a close friend show that mirror to you, it was an instant change in my mood, because then I could laugh at it and say, aha, oh, I get it. I can recognize that I'm having this response, and it's no longer a sense. I can check my sense of life and say, yeah, okay, we knew that Rome has been built on top of each other, so I don't need to have that reaction. I can check my sense of life and enjoy what I was seeing instead. So sometimes it'd be really helpful to have that trusted friend with you who's gonna, tell you that they noticed something about your reaction.
I also agree with all of you that this is like, that's a fantastic observation. Just to quote Rand for a moment, she tells us all the way back at the very beginning of the book, she tells us that art makes it possible for a man to perceive his abstract values by an act of direct, immediate awareness. And I think that's what we're seeing when we look at art. We're saying this is what life should be, or, oh no, this is not what life should be. And I entirely agree that as we go looking at different art, that sense, we may not be able to put a name to it, but we'll get the feeling. And as we continue to do so and to seek out, as Shrikant says, great works of art, it'll help give us a little more clarity on that, what's pinging us, what is resonating with you. And you can move towards that direction, because that's helping you, like Ayn Rand tells us, to bring out of our subconscious into the consciousness, because as you pull it out, then you can start moving towards that. And our goal here in this little life is really self-improvement, right? We want to be better, because in being better, we will make our culture and thus the world better, right? And if you all don't believe that, sorry. But that's how I see the purpose of being here. And I think that art is like, it's a fantastic way of, like, it's like a ping. You know how when computers ping? That's kind of what we're doing here as we're looking at things.
So one of the things we do in these meetups is syntopical connections between meetups. So just before this, we had a meetup on Julian Jaynes. And one of his core ideas is what writing does to your mind. That when you write something down, you can reflect on it. And that allows you to really shape your thinking. Kind of externalizing allows you to shape your thinking. It makes it far more comprehensive, far more precise, far more powerful. And one of the attendees brought up a very interesting example of that. His daughter's school asked the children to draw their own self-portraits, draw themselves every day. And he noticed how, the picture that his daughter drew changed over the year. Okay, I think it was, we didn't get a time to fully explore that, but that is really, really powerful thing for a kid or for anybody to do, because you're putting down your entire view of yourself down on paper, and you are looking at it, and you're doing it day after day after day. What do you guys think about that?
That's a powerful assignment.
I wish I had that teacher. That's my quick answer.
It takes a lot of courage.
Sherri, what did you say?
I said that's a powerful assignment. I'm blown away by that. That would be amazing too. And I'm sure that there is some, you're seeing, if you're looking at a whole class of kids doing this, you're able to really see what's going on with them. I mean, children's art tells you a lot about what's on their mind, because children also show, like adult artists, they show what's important to them in their work. So that would be really fascinating to see, both at a child level, that progression, but also an adult level.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next up is, let me see. Rupali, you had a question or comment?
I have a few comments. Is it okay?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm going to take that last point you mentioned about drawing. One of the things that our teachers do is for children who are struggling to behave properly in the classroom or complete their assignments or whatever, there's some internal struggle going on. And every day, at the end of the day, they give them a simple graphic of a smiley face, a not so smiley face, a sad face, an okay face. And then just 4 little emoji pictures hand drawn. And then for the children who can't read or write, they just say, how do you feel? And the child can then express themselves very well. And they keep that every day. They do it before lunch and at the end of the day, before lunch and at the end of the day. And then you see over time, because they are able to now reflect on their own emotions, they can start regulating their emotions. And so for the children who are older, 2nd grade and up, they draw their own emotions at the end, like, and they can start reflecting. And in upper elementary and middle school, they have a reflection sheet. What was I doing? Why was I doing it? And what am I going to do going forward? Just 3 questions that they have to. And this was something a child came up with because he was struggling with something. And that reflection helps them to understand. So going back to your point about writing, allows them to take a step back and think about it. So from a child's perspective, it's very helpful for them to draw what they think or feel. So that was one thing. I had initially said I'd put my comment in for Sherri before this. So let me go to that point. So Sherri, I loved your impressions of all the statues that you showed us, right? And when I had first seen The Fearless Girl, before I'd read your articles, what the images was about this defiant child from my classroom. Child who is not necessarily fearless, but just defiant. I'm going to do what I want to do, and you can't tell me anything, even though you're the adult, or I'm just going to be. And that was the idea. That was the first image that came to my mind. I didn't know about the wind, the child standing against the wind, and now that makes sense with the dress blowing and things like that. But then the torso, the vitality torso that you showed, and everything about it, the first word that came to my mind was gait, G-A-I-T, the gait in dance, right? The movement in dance, when you move your body in just the right manner. And there's the element of balance, there's the element of beauty, there's the element of grace, everything that are elements of composition that add to a beautiful piece of art. And you don't need the whole figure, you can just see that in that movement. So thank you for sharing that. And I feel, as a question that I would pose, this was something that was posed much before, is how do you teach that to children? How do you educate even adults who've not had that that experience as a child to understand literature or art? How do you teach them to come up to kind of appreciate this and to look and observe? I think we've discussed this multiple times, but that just brought me back to that question that Jonathan, I think, had posed in one of the first meetups.
This is actually a good sort of jump to the things of beauty that I'll be talking about a couple of weeks from now. And my explicit goal when I was doing that was for myself to really and deeper enjoy the things that I was finding, but to help others start to see it. And it really was, it was the words that I used. I repeatedly, now anybody will go back and read my Things of Beauty columns and they're going to start laughing, because I keep using the phrase, look here, notice this, observe that. And essentially just using those, all you need to do is point out one little thing. And you open that door to observing, and pretty soon it will happen on their own. So if you're teaching children, anytime you can on any little thing, you could just say, oh, notice this. And then pretty soon they're going to be noticing things and saying it back to you. It could be just as easy as to say you're driving down the road and the sun is setting, and you can say, oh, look, there's purple and blue and pink and orange and yellow and gold and magenta. Do you see where the magenta is? You just call the focus to it. And that's, I mean, what's the old phrase? You can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can bring something to someone's attention. They have to do the thinking.
But you know, as you keep doing that, and we've noticed this with the kids, is that they will then bring things like that up to us.
Mm-hmm. It becomes a habit.
Like the colors of the sunset. You know, look at all the different colors of the sunset. That's something that she teaches them. And then once you walk them through it, they become capable of doing it themselves. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, now I'm not, you're more of an expert on Montessori, but I know this from our kids that, you know, the guide will sit down with the kids and they'll go show them how to, they'll actually, especially the younger ages, they'll just do the work in front of them. No, mm-hmm. They won't talk about it. They'll just do it, do the individual steps. And the child is watching, and the child, by watching the guide go through the steps, they know what the steps are, and then they do it themselves. And it's a similar thing that if you see Sherri go through the steps of analyzing a work of art, you get an idea for, oh, that's how I do it. This is what I look for. This is how you have a whole set of questions that she'll put in your mind that you can then bring to anything else you see.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to make a quick comment on the question of how do you instill this in adults who didn't have the benefit as children? And my thought, you know, the first word that came to mind, Rupali, was encourage them to slow down. You know, and the second thing was by example. So I in general, in my professional environment, I'm surrounded by technical people, and they're not necessarily very artistic, but I have found that the random, like, you know, when you're walking from one office building to another, I have an obsession with trees, and I have a really bad habit of I stop for trees, right? And, you know, to point out to an adult who's an engineer, and you're their boss, right? And you're the finance person, and you manage their money. For them to see you stop underneath a tree and look up, and they're like, what the heck are you doing? We've got 20 minutes before the next meeting. And I'm like, I know. I needed to, like, you know, you explain, and it's just silly. For me, usually it's like random gibberish, you know? I can't entirely explain why, but it's a compulsion, right? I had to stop and look up, you know, and I said, you know, life is better whenever you stop and look up from underneath a tree. And that sounds almost insane, right? But you know, they take that, and now I guarantee you that the next time they pass under a tree, they're probably gonna look up. And that's so small and so silly, right? But I think we, by example, you know, if you live your life as one who's seeking out certain things, hopefully other people will have something to see in that and find their own path, hopefully.
Wonderful.
And
go ahead.
Just to make sure you don't feel bad about not having started this when you were a child, I didn't learn this when I was a child. I very, very rarely went to museums as a child. Most of what I know about art comes from college age on.
Wow. Excellent. All right, folks. So next time it's going to be Rob talking about style. And we can talk a little bit about the last chapter, but not much. But it's going to be mostly Rob talking about style. And the 1 week after that, it's going to be Sherri talking about things of beauty. and then we are going to go into kindergarten chats with Louis Sullivan. So that's the plan. And folks, we got, these meetups that are coming up. We're doing something really amazing, both on Saturdays and Sundays. So check that out. All right. See you folks soon. Bye.
Bye.